Good morning, dear learners, and once again welcome you all to the MOOC on economics of gender and development. And we are in week 5, and this is module number 17. And here we'll be talking about statistical overview, a global and Indian context. So let us begin with the major employment indicators and gender differences. Employment indicators are key statistical measures used to assess the performance, structure, and inclusivity of a labor market. And India, in the previous module also, we have seen some of the employment indicators. So these indicators provide insights into the functioning of an economy by reflecting the level and quality of employment, productivity, and participation of different population groups. Among the major indicators are the labor force participation rate, employment to population ratio, unemployment rate, underemployment rate, and wage or earning distributions. The labor force participation rate, LFPR as you call in brief, measures the proportion of the working age population that is either employed or actively seeking work. It captures the degree of engagement of the population in productive activity. When disaggregated by gender, the LFPR often reveals significant gaps. In most countries, women have lower participation rates due to barriers such as unpaid domestic responsibilities, sociocultural norms, and unequal access to education or childcare facilities. The employment to population ratio reflects the proportion of the working age population actually employed. This measure highlights gender disparities in access to employment and the availability of decent work opportunities. Women's employment is often concentrated in informal, part time, or low paid sectors, reflecting both horizontal and vertical labor market segregation. The unemployment rate, which measures the percentage of labor force without work but seeking employment, also manifests gender asymmetrics. Women tend to experience higher rates of long term and structural unemployment, often related to discrimination, occupational segregation, or interruptions in career pathways due to caregiving roles. And these things we have already seen in other modules. Finally, wage or earnings indicators expose gender gaps in compensation or comparable work. The persistent gender wage gap remains a global issue, reflecting systemic biases and occupational hierarchies. So, overall, gender disaggregated employment indicators are vital for identifying inequalities in labor markets, supporting policy formulation, and promoting inclusive growth that ensures equal opportunities for all genders. Now, let us look at some of the gender based global employment scenario, some indicators. The global employment landscape is characterized by a complex interplay of resilience and persistent structural imbalances, with gender serving as a primary axis of disparity. While the post pandemic recovery saw global unemployment drop to 5.4% in 2023, a deeper academic analysis reveals that gender participation gaps, informality, and working poverty remains entrenched. So, in this section, we shall try to explore these dynamics through a comparative lens, focusing on the differences between developed and developing economies, with a special attention on India and South Asian region. So, let us look at the global disparities in participation and the job gap. A critical metric in gender analysis is the job gap, which encompasses all individuals who desire employment regardless of their current search status. Globally, the job gap rate or unemployment rate for women stood at 13.7% in 2023, significantly higher than 9.3% recorded for men. This disparity is even more pronounced in low income and lower middle income countries, where the female jobs gap surpasses that of men by nearly 7 percentage points. While female labor force participation rates recovered faster than anticipated following the the COVID-19 pandemic, the global participation rate for men is projected to exceed that of women by 25 percentage points in 2025. Furthermore, young women are disproportionately represented in the NEET, that is, not in employment, education, or training category, particularly in low income nations where they face severe obstacles to long term labor market attachment. Now, labor market imbalances manifest differently across the development spectrum. In developed, the high income countries, the primary challenge is a structural labor shortage driven by population aging and a mismatch between required skills and available candidates. Interestingly, although high income regions show higher female engagement, such as 34% in the United States and Canada, these regions are currently witnessing a well being crisis among female managers. Female managers in these developed contexts saw a 7 percentage point drop in both management and well being over the past year, navigating a widening gap between executive demands and employee expectations. On the other hand, developing or low income countries are defined by a shortage of jobs rather than a shortage of labor. So, in these countries, informality is the norm, with over 80% of workers in Africa and Asia holding informal positions that lack legal or social protections. For example, in the agricultural sector, which remains a primary employer in lower income regions, women represent 39.6% of the workforce but are significantly more likely to be engaged in unpaid family labor or self employment rather than receiving a regular wage. Now, looking at the women's work and employment scenario, we find that the Global Gender Gap Report 2025, we referred to this report in the earlier module as well, it suggests that in case of women occupying top executive positions, progress is stalling. Since 2022, the share of women in top management has barely moved. So this seems to be a paradox. While women hold more tertiary degrees than men, which we see in 190 countries, yet only 20.5% of tertiary educated senior managers are women. Another noticeable gender disparity notice is the fields of work. And we can see from figure 1 that women are primarily engaged in education, healthcare, and care services. Okay? When they are lagging behind the fields like sectors like infrastructure, supply chain and transportation, oil, gas, and mining, like the basically the manufacturing sector, they are lagging behind. So, in the previous module we also discussed the adverse impact women face because of care-related works, be it for childcare or anything others. And in figure 2, it shows we will see how the care economy adversely affects the work and career of the woman. Here we see the care economy is the invisible tax. It's like an invisible tax on female talent. Okay. Now looking at the case of India and South Asia. South Asia presents one of the starkest examples of gender-based employment disparities. The region has labor force participation gender gap of 45.9 percentage points, with only 30.8% of women participating in the labor force as of 2023. Despite this low participation, there has been a recent, albeit distance-driven, surge in female employment in the agricultural sector. For example, India is the primary driver of this trend. Between 2020 and 2023, approximately 33 million women entered the agricultural sector globally, and nearly 80% of this increase occurred in India alone. Academic studies suggest this shift was not a pathway to economic empowerment, but a survival strategy following the collapse of urban informal jobs due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So most of these women are engaged as unpaid family workers, highlighting a continued dependence on low-paying informal agricultural work. And looking at the issues of engagement, stress, and management dynamics, we see that on a global scale, female employee engagement, roughly 22%, is slightly higher than male engagement, 21%, and 38% of women are thriving in life compared to 30% of men. However, these figures are tempered by high levels of daily stress, which is reported by 40% of both genders globally. Now, in developed nations, women often report significantly higher stress than men. For example, in the United States and Canada, 55% of women report daily stress compared to 46% of men. So, this stress gap, quote and unquote, is often attributed to the unbalanced burden of unpaid care responsibilities, including household duties and childcare, which remains disproportionately handled by women. And in the agricultural sector, specifically, women work an average of 36.7 hours per week compared to 41.2 hours for men, a gap that likely reflects the necessity for women to seek part-time arrangements to balance domestic labor. Likewise, the South Asian women also report high levels of negative daily emotions. While the region's overall engagement is relatively high at 26%, the source data shows that 48% of women in South Asia report daily sadness compared to 36% of men, and 40% report daily anger. This suggests that even when employment numbers rise, the quality of life, particularly quality of work life, and psychological well-being for women in this region remain precarious. Now, looking at technological science and the future outlook on gender, we will see that the emergence of artificial intelligence, AI, and digital transformation present both a risk and an opportunity for gender equity. In developed economies, AI has the potential to alleviate labor shortages but also risk severing human bonds and increasing the disconnect felt by managers. For developing countries, high entry barriers and a lack of digital infrastructure may hinder the ability of women to leapfrog into more productive sectors, potentially widening the global gender technology gap. Now, if we again review the issue of climate change, trade contradictions, and adverse effects on women, how these effects adversely affect women, you will see that the adverse impact of climate change on women we have already discussed in the earlier module 13, and we saw how women in countries like Bangladesh they suffered during cyclones and like this. And there are in general issues where women are more adversely affected by climate change issues. And studies also indicate that women suffer the most in case there are any global trade contractions. And this may be seen in figure 3. Okay, here we see that 1% contraction in global trade, 11 million jobs lost, and 4.5 million of those jobs are held by women. So these trade shocks disproportionately affect women in export-oriented sectors, manufacturing or agri, in developing economies, often pushing them back into the informal economy. And when you look at the gender-based analysis of global employment scenario, we will see this, that the global employment scenario for women is one of the resilience under pressure, and we have discussed these things. And while developed countries struggle with the burnout of female leaders and high stress, developing countries like India face a structural trap of informality and distress-driven agricultural labor. And addressing these challenges requires a coordinated policy response that goes beyond headline unemployment figures to target work conditions, the care economy, and equitable access to high productivity sectors. Now, without such interventions, the structural headwinds of population aging, climate change, and technological shifts are likely to further entrench existing gender disparities. Now, let us look at the recent advancements as reflected in the MDG and SDG report, particularly relating to advancements in gender equity, equality, like that. So, the global landscapes of gender development in recent years presents a dichotomy of significant historical achievements tempered by persistent structural barriers and emerging crises. And it is important to note that the trajectory of global gender development has been defined by two major frameworks, the Millennium Development Goals, which concluded in 2015, and the ongoing Sustainable Development Goals, which has been targeted for 2030. So while the world has transitioned from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, the progress towards absolute gender equality remains off track. So from data from this Millennium Development Goals Report 2015 and the Gender Snapshot 2025, both published by the United Nations, these indicate that while legal reforms and educational parity have advanced in most of the countries, the triple threats of conflict, climate change, and economic instability are stalling. And in some cases, it's actually reversing. Hard-won gains for women and girls. A few important points from these two reports have been discussed in this section. First, let us start with poverty and economic exclusion. So, a critical issue in the recent global scenario is the persistent feminization of poverty. As of 2025, an estimated 9.2% of women and girls, approximately 376 million of global population, live in extreme poverty compared to 8.6% of men and boys. If current trends continue, over 351 million women will still reside in extreme poverty by the year 2030. And this economic disparity is largely driven by unequal labor market participation. Globally, only 46.4% of working age women are employed, compared to 69.5% of men. Furthermore, women continue to shoulder a disproportionate burden of unpaid domestic and care work, devoting 2.5 times as many hours per day to this task as men. We have seen this, we have discussed this in earlier modules as well. And in terms of regional performance, Sub-Saharan Africa remains the most challenged, with 233 million women projected to live in extreme poverty by 2030. Conversely, Saudi Arabia stands out as a high performer in recent years, having successfully doubled its female labor force participation from 70% in 2017 to 35.4% in 2024 through deliberate policy reforms. Gender issues in health and nutrition have become increasingly acute. The sources reveal a widening global gender gap in food insecurity, with nearly 64 million more female adults than males being food insecure as of 2025. And dietary deficiencies are escalating the risk of anemia among women aged 15 to 49, with rates projected to rise from 31.1% in 2025 to 33% by 2030. And maternal health has been long-term improvement, with maternal mortality declining by 39.3% between 2000 and 2023. However, women still spend an average of 10.9 years in poor health compared to 8 years for men. And geographically, the worst dietary diversity for women is recorded in Mozambique and Uganda, where only 28.8% and 12.7% of women respectively consume nutrient-sufficient diets. In contrast, countries like Mexico and Peru have shown significant progress in ensuring skilled health personnel attend births for marginalized groups such as indigenous women. And when we consider education and the digital divide issues, we find that in education, a major historical achievement was the elimination of gender disparity in primary school enrollment across the developing world by 2015. By 2025, girls have surpassed boys in global enrollment and completion rates. However, progress is uneven at the secondary level, with girls still lagging in sub-Saharan Africa and Central and Southern Asia. A new frontier of inequality is the gender digital divide. Globally, 70% of men use the internet compared to 65% of women. This gap is most pronounced in the least developed countries, where only 29% of women are online. Rwanda is highlighted as the best performing country in this sector, with digital inclusion initiatives significantly improving access to tools and training for women. Similarly, Uganda and Costa Rica have implemented national plans to engage girls in coding and digital literacy. Now, looking at the issue of leadership and governance, we see that political representation remains a major bottleneck for gender development. While women's seat in national parliaments rose from 27.2% by 2025, up from 19% in 1995, An astonishing 102 countries have never had a woman head of state or government. Women are blocked by a glass ceiling in the corporate world, holding only 30% of managerial positions. And at the current pace, achieving parity in management will take nearly a century. Rwanda continues to lead the world in parliamentary representation, with women holding over 60% seats. And other notable improvements occurred in Bolivia and Andorra. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, the situation in Afghanistan is catastrophic. Since the Taliban took power, all female judges in the country have been removed from the judiciary, erasing decades of progress the country made. Now, looking at the issues of violence, conflict, and climate change, we see that safety remains a paramount issue, as over 1 in 8 women aged 15 to 49 has been subjected to physical and sexual violence by an intimate partner in the last 12 months. And prevalence rates are particularly alarming in Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Papua New Guinea, where they exceed 30%. The recent global scenario is also defined by the impact of armed conflict and climate change. In 2024, approximately 676 million women and girls lived near a deadly conflict event, the highest number recorded since 1990s. And additionally, a worst case climate scenario could push up to 158.3 million more women into extreme poverty by 2050, with nearly half residing in sub-Saharan Africa. And looking at the intersecting inequalities, we will see that the sources emphasize that progress often bypasses those facing multiple norms of discrimination. For example, women and disabilities are less than half as likely to use the internet as women overall and are far less likely to have their family planning needs met. Indigenous women also face severe service gaps. For example, in Paraguay, 50.2% women in indigenous households lack access to improved water compared to just 3.8% of the general female population. In the Philippines, indigenous women are nearly 4 times as likely to lack adequate water access as the national average. And when we consider the better and poor performing scenarios, states, we will see that the best performing countries are those that have combined legal reform with targeted investments. And here the countries like Rwanda is a global leader in both political representation and digital inclusion. And Saudi Arabia has shown rapid progress in labor force participation. And Ecuador, Georgia, and Kenya have successfully used gender data to drive legislative changes regarding femicide and specialized courts. Conversely, the worst performing countries are found in regions plagued by conflict and institutional collapse. For example, Afghanistan has seen a total reversal of women's civil liberties and professional representation in the recent times after the country was conquered by the Taliban groups. And sub-Saharan Africa remains the epicenter of the female poverty and energy access crisis, with 523 million women in the region lacking clean cooking fuels. And finally, Oceania, excluding Australia and New Zealand, reports some of the highest rates of intimate partner violence, affecting over 1 in 4 women. The sources conclude, so from these studies we conclude that while 230 goals are currently out of reach, a different path remains possible through bold investments in digital access, social protection, and the care economy. Now let us undertake a comparative analysis of global gender development, developed versus developing nations. A comparative analysis between developed and developing nations demonstrates that while developed regions have achieved near universal access to basic services, developing regions struggle with structural barriers, emerging digital divides, and the disproportionate impact of climate change and conflict. And in this section, we shall briefly make a comparative analysis between developed and developing countries in a few important aspects. For example, looking at the economic disparities and labor markets, we see that extreme poverty remains a predominantly developing world crisis. Globally, 9.2% of women and girls live in extreme poverty, but the distribution is starkly unequal. In developed regions such as Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, female extreme poverty is negligible, often recorded at 0.1% or even less. Conversely, in sub-Saharan Africa, 35.1% of women live in extreme poverty, a figure projected to remain higher without an accelerated SDG push. And in the labor market, developed countries have higher female participation in non-agricultural wage employment, 48%, compared to developing nations like Southern Asia, 21%, and Northern Africa, 19%. However, developed nations face a unique modern challenge, which is generative AI. Women in high income countries are nearly thrice as likely as men to be in jobs at high risk of automation, 9.6% versus 3.4%, largely due to their concentration in clerical and administrative roles. And in developing nations, the primary barrier remains informal work and a lack of social protection, with 2 billion women and girls globally lacking any form of social safety net. And regarding the issue of health, nutrition, and food security, we see that the health gap between developed and developing nations is one of the most persistent indicators of inequality. Maternal mortality in developing nations is approximately 14 times higher than in developed regions. And while developed countries enjoy nearly universal skilled birth attendance, rates in sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia linger around 52%. And food insecurity has also emerged as a gendered issue, with 64 million more female adults experiencing food insecurity than males globally. The nutritional crisis is also most acute in developing nations. For instance, in Uganda and Mozambique, only 12.7% and 20.8% of women respectively achieve minimum dietary diversity. And in contrast, developed regions have largely mitigated these basic nutritional deficits but face rising rates of chronic conditions, with women generally spending 10.9 years in poor health compared to 8 years for men. Now, looking at the issue of the digital frontier and education, we see that a significant historical achievement was the elimination of gender disparity in primary school enrollment across developing regions by 2015. However, a digital revolution has created a new divide. In high-income countries, internet use is nearly universal, with 93% of women are online. In least developed countries, this figure drops to 29%. The sources suggest that closing the digital gap could lift 30 million women and girls out of extreme poverty by 2050. And when we make a comparative performance analysis, we see that Rwanda emerges as a global leader in political representation, where women hold over 60% of parliamentary seats. It is also noted for successful digital inclusion initiatives and for allowing teen mothers to return to schools. And Saudi Arabia has made rapid reforms, doubling female labor force participation from 17 in 2017 to 35.4% in 2024. And countries like Mexico and Peru have been quite successful in increasing skilled birth attendance and indigenous women to over 80%. And on the contrary, countries like Afghanistan is showing a catastrophic reversal of rights. The country has seen the total removal of female judges and exhibits higher intimate partner violence, it exceeding rate 30%. And the Oceania region, excluding Australia and New Zealand, reports the highest global prevalence of IPV, with over 1 in 4 women, 28.6% are affected. And the sub-Saharan Africa remains the epicenter of the clean energy crisis, where 523 million women lack clean cooking gas, clean cooking fuels, leading to severe health risks from indoor pollution. And now let us briefly look at India's progress in the context of developing countries. So India occupies a pivotal position in the global gender landscape. During the MDG era, India and China were the primary drivers of global poverty reduction. Southern Asia, led by India's trajectory, saw a dramatic increase in the primary school enrollment ratio, moving from 74 girls per 100 boys in 1990 to 103 girls per 100 boys in 2015. And India has demonstrated significant progress in infrastructure-linked gender benefits. Specifically, these reports note that a 1 hour increase in community electricity in rural India leads to a measurable decline in gender-based violence and 0.6 percentage point increase in contraceptive use. This highlights how gender-neutral investments in energy can have profound impacts on women's safety and reproductive autonomy. However, challenges persist. India remains part of a group of 5 countries that housed 60% of world's extremely poor as of 2011. Furthermore, while Southern Asia has seen maternal mortality decline by 64%, the region still carries a high burden of anemia, which results in an annual economic loss of $32.5 billion. In terms of governance, while India has improved its data systems, the wider Central and Southern Asia region still shows pronounced gap in female representation in the public service and judiciary, with a ratio of only 0.52 and 0.46% relative to population shares. The comparative analysis reveals that gender equality is not merely a social goal, but a foundational requirement for economic and environmental sustainability. Developed nations have largely solved issues of access but face new threats from technological automation. Developing nations, including India, have made fast strides in education and poverty reduction but remain vulnerable to triple crises of conflict, climate change, and economic instability. The path forward, as suggested by Beijing Plus 30 Action Agenda, requires shifting from mere policy frameworks to fully financed national action plans that prioritize digital inclusion, the care economy, and the ending of all forms of violence. And please note that as per the Beijing Plus 30 Action Agenda, led by UN Women, marks 30 years since 1995 Beijing Declaration by focusing on 6 key priority areas to accelerate gender equality: digital revolution, freedom from poverty, zero violence, equal decision making, peace and security, and climate justice. So, supported by 159 member states, this initiative aims to turn policy commitments into measurable, funded progress for women and girls by 2030. So, to sum up our module, we have seen that gender gaps in labor force participation, wages, leadership, and access to decent work remain deeply entrenched, especially in developing economies where informality, unpaid care work, and distress-driven employment dominate women's work experiences. The comparative perspective between developed and developing countries highlight a crucial insight: progress is neither uniform nor linear. Developed economies face emerging risks from automation, stress, and burnout, while developing regions struggle with poverty, weak social protection, and climate vulnerability. India's experience exemplifies the dual reality, combining notable gains in education and infrastructure with enduring challenges seen in employment equality and women's economic empowerment. And overall, the analysis makes clear that gender equality cannot be achieved through isolated interventions or aggregate growth alone. It requires coordinated, well-financed policies that recognizes unpaid care work, expand digital and economic access, strengthen social protection, and safeguard women's well-being. And without such transformative action, existing disparities risk becoming further entrenched in the face of technological, climate, and economic change. And thank you. And with this, we come to the end of this module. And in the next module, we shall take up the discussion on population and gender. Thank you.